والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من إلى علمنا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. فإن شاء الله نستمر. We'll continue with reading from the book entitled Al-Awsat في السنن والإجماع والاختلاف, that medium-sized book relating or conveying the sunan and the consensus, the ijma', as well as the ikhtilaf. And we've reached the chapter where the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, ذكر اختلاف أهل العلم فيما يجب على الرائف. This chapter is regarding mentioning the disagreement of the people of knowledge regarding what is necessary or what is wajib, what is obligatory for a nosebleed. What is the obligation that an individual has to do if they suffer from a nosebleed? And we see after mentioning al-istihada, that non-menstrual bleeding that is continuous, he mentioned after that those chronic ahdath, those chronic conditions that consistently or perpetually nullify one's purification, regarding men bihi salas al-bawl, those individuals who have chronic urination or chronic gas. And now he's relating that non-menstrual bleeding to something else that is similar to it from a different aspect. So if the non-menstrual bleeding consisted of two things, bleeding and a chronic perpetual hadith, then the first thing he compared to it was those chronic perpetual ahdath, like chronic urination. But now he's mentioning that which is comparable to the other aspect of non-menstrual bleeding, which is the exiting of blood from an orifice other than the private parts. And like we'll see how he relates this, and likewise al-hijama and other things, which the question is, does bleeding nullify one's wudu? If an individual bleeds, does it negate their purification? So the author, he says, this chapter is regarding the disagreement of the people of knowledge regarding what is obligatory on one who suffers a nosebleed. If you have a nosebleed, do you have to make wudu? قال رحمه الله تعالى واختلفوا فيما يجب على الرائف فأوجبت طائفة عليه الوضوء فممن روينا عنه أنه رأى أن عليه الوضوء عمر وعلي وسلمان وكان ابن عمر إذا رعف انصرف فتوضأ ثم رجع وبنى وكذلك فعل ابن المسيب وعلقمة بن قيس وهو مذهب إبراهيم وقتادة وعطاء ومكحول. He says the scholars, they disagree regarding the individual who has a nosebleed. The scholars, they disagree regarding the individual who suffers from a nosebleed. So one group of them made it wajib upon that individual to perform a wudu. One group of scholars made it wajib upon such an individual to perform a wudu. He says, so from those who it has been transmitted to us about them, that they deemed it obligatory for that individual to make wudu, was Umar, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and Ali, Ali ibn Abi Talib, was Salman, Salman al-Farisi. He says, وَكَانَ ibn Umar, and Abdullah ibn Umar, وَكَانَ ibn Umar إِذَا رَعَفَ انصرف فتوضأ ثم رجع وبنى. If Ibn Umar had a nosebleed, he would leave, i.e. he would leave his salah. If his nose started bleeding during his salat, he would leave the salat that he was praying, go and make a wudu, and then he would return to the salat and pick up where he left off. If Ibn Umar suffered a nosebleed, he would leave the salat that he was praying. In saraf, he would leave, i.e. the salat, then go and make wudu. And then after that, he would return and pick up. He would build from where he left off. He would pick up the salat from where he left off. I.e., if he was in ruku', he would go back to the ruku' that he was in. If he was in sujood, he would go back to the sujood that he was in and continue his salat from that moment. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says, وَكَذَلِكَ فَعَلَ ibn al-Musayyib. And likewise, this was done by Ibn al-Musayyib, yani Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib. And he's referring to the entirety of what is being referenced here, the making wudu, the leaving of the salat, the making wudu, and the picking up where you left off. Or it could be that he's just referencing it to the action of making wudu. And we'll see in the narrations that he brings which way does it seem like he is implying. But an individual has to understand that. When you read these statements and somebody says, and this was also the action of Ibn Musayyib, for example, does he mean the entirety of what he attributed to Ibn Umar? Or does he only mean the aspect that is the topic of conversation right now, which is making wudu from a nosebleed? In either situation, he says this was also the view of Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib or Ibn al-Musayyib, as well as Alqama ibn Qais. Alqama ibn Qais, who was known as Al-Nakha'i. Alqama ibn Qais Al-Nakha'i, from the students of Ibn Mas'ud. He says, and this is the madhab of Ibrahim. This is also the madhab of Ibrahim. Ibrahim al-Nakha'i was the student of Alqama, who was one of the scholars of Kufa of his time. And because of his nobility and his jalala, although he never met a sahabi, they used to count him amongst the tabi'een. Even though it's not established that he ever met a sahabi, they used to count him amongst the tabi'een. The author, he says, وَهُوَ مَذْهَبُ Ibrahim. This was the view of Ibrahim, as well as Qatada ibn Di'ama, Sadusi. Likewise, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, and Makhul, right? All of these Salaf from the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, they had this view that the individual, if he suffers a nosebleed, he should go and make wudu. And a nosebleed is something that is very common and easy to occur in those environments. With the dry air and the hot weather, it was common that an individual, his nose, the mucus would dry, it would stick, it would cause, and if you scratched, it would bleed. And so this is why you find them often talking about what is upon the individual who has a nosebleed, because it's something that you would see often in such environments. So all of these Salaf, Umar, Ali, Salman, Ibn Umar, likewise the Tabi'een, Ibn Musayyib, and Alqama, and Ibrahim, and Qatada, and Ata, and Makhul, all of them used to have this view. And from the things that we benefited was that even Abdullah bin Umar, if he had a nosebleed, he would go make wudu and return to the salat and build from that same spot, which is an issue in itself that we'll get to at some point in time. The author, he says, وَهَذَا مَذْهَبُ الثَّوْرِي فِي الْجَرْحِ لَا يَرْقَى أَنَّ عَلَيْهِ الْوُضُوء وَهُوَ قَوْلُ أَحْمَدْ فِي الرُّعَافِ وَبِهِ قَالَ أَصْحَابُ الرَّأْيِ. He says, and this is the madhab as well of Al-Thawri, yani Sufyan ibn Sa'id ibn Masruq Al-Thawri, from the scholars of the people of Kufa, who had a madhab that used to rival the madhab of Abi Hanifa, right? From the people of Hadith, and Amir al-Mu'mineen fil Hadith, Sufyan Al-Thawri. This was his madhab. As it relates to a wound that was not pulsating blood. If an individual had a wound where the blood wasn't gushing, he still had this view that an individual needed to make wudu. This was the view of the madhab of Sufyan al-Thawri regarding a wound that wasn't pulsating, that individual needed to make wudu still. And this is because there's going to be a difference of opinion regarding if a person has an open wound and there's blood sitting in the wound. Does the blood that is sitting in the wound nullify the wudu? Or is it not nullified until the blood actually pulsates out or gushes out, right? Like a pimple where the blood sits in the pimple, right? Whereas as a nosebleed, the blood gushes out. But an open wound, somebody scratches off a scab, somebody cuts their finger and the blood is sitting in the finger. Does that necessitate a wudu or not? Sufyan al-Thawri would say yes. The author, he says, وَهُوَ قَوْلُ أَحْمَدْ. This was also the view of Imam Ahmed. Imam Ahmed was known that the blood, when it was fahish, if it was something that was fahish, like outside the boundaries of not being disgusted by it, right? Once the blood became something that was fahish, or something that an individual would be disgusted by it in its sight, in its presence, then he would necessitate that the individual make a wudu. So he says that this is the statement of Imam Ahmed regarding a nosebleed. And it was also the view adopted by the people of Ra'i. Yani Abu Hanifa and his companions, Ashab al-Ra'i, they also adopted this view. So this view of blood, especially a nosebleed, we see that a lot of scholars held this view. This was the view of a lot of scholarship of the time. But we also want to bear in mind that the author here is mentioning it amongst the things that are what? That are disagreed about. And we've already seen from the author that the things that he mentions that are disagreed about, it's showing he's mentioning them as a way of weakening that view, as if he's saying that even though some scholars have said this, this view is not accurate. And like this, whether we deem his opinion to be correct or incorrect, right? That's not the goal or the agenda as of right now, to see who is right and who's wrong, but instead to familiarize ourselves with the statement of the Salaf. But one thing that we do know from reading what we're going to read in this section is that those who claim that there is a consensus that blood nullifies one's purification in general, that is something that is a little bit hard to agree to. Even if the consensus has been attested to by who it was attested to by from various scholars, if I'm not mistaken, from the Imam Ahmed rahimahullah. But we're going to see that there are views that blood does not nullify the wudu or the purification. So it's something that we should pay attention to. After mentioning those who adopted this view that the individual needs to make a wudu, the author Ibn al-Mundhir, he mentions his chain to all of that information that he began with. And so he says, حدثنا علي بن عبد العزيز قال حدثنا حجاج قال حدثنا حماد عن حجاج عن خالد بن سلمة عن محمد بن الحارث بن أبي ضرار أن عمر بن الخطاب كان يصلي بأصحابه فرعف فأخذ بيد رجل فقدمه ثم ذهب فتوضأ ثم جاء فصلى ما بقي عليه من صلاته ولم يتكلم. Now, this first narration, he says, and bear in mind, for those who haven't necessarily studied Islamic jurisprudence, they haven't really studied fiqh or hadith in any intensive way. When you read the statements of the Salaf, you're going to find views and opinions that might be strange to you, that might be uncommon, especially depending on where you are in your stage of information or what land you're in as it relates to how much information is disseminated. And our agenda, our goal isn't to produce a bunch of strange information, but it is something that is worth noticing and paying attention to, that these were the madhahib of the Salaf. And so they should be treated with the respect that they deserve and not automatically dismissed because of what they go against from a madhahib, no matter how prominent or popular that madhab or that statement of a scholar is in your area or in yourself. So the narration that he brings here, he says that Ali ibn Abdul Aziz, he narrated to us. He said that Hajjaj narrated to us. He said that Hamad narrated to us on the authority of Hajjaj, on the authority of Khalid ibn Salama, on the authority of Muhammad ibn al-Harith ibn Abi Dhirar, who said that Umar ibn al-Khattab, once while making salat with his companions, suffered a nosebleed. And so he took the hand of an individual and pulled him to the front. Qaddamahu, right? He took the hand of someone who was praying behind him and he put that person in front of the people. So in this, there's this athar, this narration also gives us the benefit of al-istikhlaf, right? The imam appointing somebody to jump in and fill in his place if something happens that nullifies his wudu during the salat, or something happens that forces him to leave the salat, he can appoint somebody from those behind him to pray in place of him, without the entirety of the jama'ah needing to reset and start over. That secondary imam can pick up from exactly where the original imam was at. So Ibn al-Mundhir, he mentions with his chain that Umar once, while praying with his companions, suffered a nosebleed. So he took the hand of a man and he pushed him, or he pulled him forward. He brought him to the forefront. And then he, i.e. Umar, left and made wudu. He left and then made wudu. And then after a while returned. Right? And the huruf here, it's something to pay attention to. فَأَخَذَ, right? Ra'atha, he was praying, he was in the middle of his salat, and then after that, fara'atha, right? Ta'qib, right? Of close proximity, while making that salat, he started to suffer a nosebleed. Fa'akhadha. And then right after that, he grabbed somebody's hand. He didn't delay, but instead, immediately after, once he did something that nullified his wudu, he grabbed somebody's hand and brought them to the front. And then he went and then made wudu right after that. And then, and it shows a length, a period of time. It took him time to make wudu. Right? When we see this issue of al-bina, somebody might say, well, you can't turn your face away from the qibla, wala yatul al-fasl, and things like this. Right? But we see here that Umar, it took him a while. He had to go out of the masjid, make wudu, and then return. And this narration, he says, so Umar, he made wudu immediately after that, and then he came back and he prayed what was left upon him from his salah. He did not start over. He prayed what was left upon him from his salat. Salla ma baqiya alayhi min salatihi. He prayed that which was left upon him from his salat, and he did not speak, i.e. in that period of time from when he nullified his wudu according to this view, and to when he came back and completed his salat from where he left off, he did not speak. Naam. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says, حدثنا علي قال حدثنا حجاج قال حدثنا حماد عن حجاج عن أبي إسحاق الحمداني عن عاصم بن ضمرة أن عليا رضي الله تعالى عنه قال إذا وجد أحدكم رزا في بطنه في الصلاة من بول أو قيء أو غائط أو رعافا فلينصرف فليتوضأ ثم ليرجع فليصلي ما لم يصليه. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says that Ali narrated to us. He said that Hajjaj narrated to us. He said that Hamad narrated to us. He said on the authority of Hajjaj, on the authority of Abi Ishaq al-Hamdani, on the authority of Asim ibn Dhamrah, who said that Ali, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he said, if one of you finds a rizzan, yani a bubbling in his stomach, right? A riz, they say in the footnotes, sotul khafi. It's a small or a quiet sound, and that grumbling in your stomach, that rumbling in your stomach. They say yuridu bihil qarqara wa qila huwa ghamzul hadith wa harakatuhu lil khuruj. Right? When you feel the hadith poking at your belly to get out, you feel you're fighting back, letting the gas out. Right? Your belly is rumbling and you're holding back the gas. Or you're holding back that urge to relieve yourself. So Umar, he said, Ali, he said, if one of you finds a rizzan, he finds this discomfort or this rumbling in his stomach while making salat because of urination or because of vomit, right? You find something that you feel that you need to vomit during salat. Or because of defecation, you feel that in the salat you need to go relieve yourself with defecation, akramakumullah. Or because of a bleeding of his nose. If an individual finds this, or Ali, he says, then he should leave and then go make wudu. I should leave the salat and go make wudu. And then he must return and he must pray what he didn't pray it yet, right? You go, you make wudu, and then you come back and you finish praying what you didn't pray from your salat before. So if you had finished 3 raka'at, what you haven't prayed is 1 raka'at. So you go back and you finish that raka'at. And so we see here Ali saying a statement similar to the action of Umar radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And as we said, this topic of al-bina, there's going to come a discussion of it. Is it the correct thing to do? Is it the incorrect thing to do? Who allowed it? Who didn't? But for right now, our agenda is the nosebleed. And so we're getting that information. But that doesn't force us to turn a blind eye to the application of the salaf to this action. And for the sake of benefit, some of them, they mentioned that this issue of building upon the salat that you didn't complete because of committing a hadith, that is only when the hadith, yani sabaqak, when it overtakes you and it forces you in the middle of your salat without a desire from you, an uncontrollable urge to break your wudu, and thus you break it, you can go and come back and build off from where you left, according to some of the statements of the people of knowledge. This is a madhab or a view of some of the people of knowledge. Now, the next narration, he says, أخبرنا محمد ابن عبد الله قال أخبرنا ابن وهب قال أخبرني عبد الله بن عمر وحنظلة بن أبي سفيان ومالك والليث وأسامة بن زيد وابن سمعان أن نافعا حدثهم أن عبد الله بن عمر كان إذا رعف انصرف فتوضأ ثم رجع فبنى على ما مضى ولم يتكلم. Naam, he says that Muhammad ibn Abdullah informed us. He said that Ibn Wahab, yani Abdullah ibn Wahab, informed us. He said that Abdullah ibn Umar, yani Abdullah ibn Umar al-Umari, right? Abdullah ibn Umar al-Umari, as well as Hanzala ibn Abi Sufyan, as well as Malik, yani Malik ibn Anas, as well as Layth, yani Layth ibn Sa'd, and Usama ibn Zayd, and Ibn Sam'an. All of them informed me about, or they informed me that Nafi, yani Nafi, the free slave of Ibn Umar, narrated to them that Abdullah ibn Umar, whenever he would suffer a nosebleed, he would leave, i.e., he would leave the salat and he would go and perform wudu. And then he would return and build off of what had transpired. He would pick up from where he left off. He would build from off of what had already transpired, and he would not talk. He would not talk in that time from when he left to when he came back. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says, حدثنا محمد بن نصر قال حدثنا إسحاق قال أخبرنا وكيع عن سفيان عن عمران بن ظبيان عن حكيم بن سعد أبي يحيى عن سلمان، يعني سلمان الفارسي، قال إذا وجد أحدكم في الصلاة رزا أو قيئا أو رعافا فلينصرف غير راع لصنيعته ثم ليتوضأ وليعد إلى بقية صلاته. وهذا أثر يعني فيه قوة لهذا المذهب. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says that Muhammad ibn Nasr narrated to us. He said that Ishaq narrated to us. He said that Waki' informed us on the authority of Sufyan, on the authority of Imran ibn Dhabiyan, on the authority of Hakim ibn Sa'd Abi Yahya, on the authority of Salman, Salman al-Farisi, who said, if one of you finds whilst making salat, if one of you finds during salat this this riz, this bubbling, i.e. in his stomach, or he finds himself needing to vomit, or a nosebleed, then let him leave. فَلْيَنْصَرَفْ, then he must leave. Let him leave the salat. غَيْرُ رَاعٍ لِصَنِيعَتِهِ, and don't let him pay any attention to his circumstance, right? Don't care about how you leave. You don't have to worry about, are you facing the Qibla the whole time, or did you turn your back to the Qibla? Which way did you walk out? Which way did you... غَيْرُ رَاعٍ لِصَنِيعَتِهِ, right? Don't worry about the action that you did, right? From whether what broke your salat or how you're leaving the masjid. Leave the salat. ثُمَّ لْيَتَوَضَّأ, and then you must go make wudu. وَلْيُعِدْ إِلَى بَقِيَّةِ صَلَاتِهِ, and then he can return back to the rest of his salat. When you get back, you can return to finish the rest of what you hadn't prayed up until that moment. Now, so these are some of the narrations that the author mentions for those who support this first view, that the nosebleed requires a wudu. He says, وفي الرعاف والدم السائل يخرج من البدن قول ثان وهو أن لا وضوء في الرعاف هذا قول طاووس وروي ذلك عن عطاء وبه قال أبو جعفر وسالم بن عبد الله وقال مكحول لا وضوء من دم إلا ما خرج من جوف أو دبر وحكي عن ربيعة أنه قال لو رعفت ملء طست ما أعدت منه الوضوء. نعم. He says, and as it relates to a nosebleed, as well as pouring blood, flowing blood, a demisile, the blood that is actually flowing from some other orifice or some other part of the body, as far as a nosebleed or blood that is pouring from some part of the body, there is a second statement as well. So we got the first statement. The second statement is that there is no wudu needed because of a nosebleed. There is no wudu necessitated by a nosebleed. And this is the statement of Tawus. And it has also been reported on Ata. Ata bin Abi Rabah had this opinion as well. وَبِهِ قَالَ Abu Ja'far. And it is also the statement of Abu Ja'far, as well as Salim ibn Abdullah, yani Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar. And Makhul, who we mentioned in the first view as well, the author, he says, and Makhul said, there is no wudu necessary because of blood unless it comes out of the stomach, yani from the inside of the person, or from his anus. And it has been stated about Rabi'ah that he used to say, if I was to bleed from my nose, that which could fill a pitcher or a tust, a tray, right? This type of tray, if I would bleed from my nose, enough blood that could fill the entire tray, I would not repeat my wudu because of it. So this is the statement of other scholars from the Tabi'een. He doesn't mention any of the Sahaba who had that view. He says, وَمِن مَّن مَذْهَبُهُ أَنْ لَا وُضُوءَ فِي الرُّعَافِ وَلَا فِي شَيْءٍ يَخْرُجُ مِنْ غَيْرِ مَوَاضِعِ الْحَدَثِ يحيى الأنصاري وربيعة ومالك. قال مالك الأمر عندنا أنه لا يتوضأ من رعاف ولا من دم ولا من قيح يسيل من الجسد وبه قال الشافعي وأبو ثور. He said, and from those who had that, and from those who this was their madhab, that there is no wudu necessary upon a person because of a nosebleed, nor in any other blood that comes from any other place of the body, besides the places from which one nullifies their wudu, i.e. the penis or the anus or the vagina. He says that this was also the view of Yahya al-Ansari, Yahya bin Sa'id al-Ansari, as well as Rabi'ah, yani Rabi'ah al-Ra'i, as well as Malik. And Malik himself, he said, the affair with us, i.e. the people of Medina, is that there is no wudu because of a nosebleed, nor from any other blood, nor from any of the pus that exits out of the body, right? That al-qayh is that yellow, clearish fluid that you find leaking out of wounds. He says in Ibn al-Mundhir, he says, and this is also what Ash-Shafi'i said, as well as Abu Thawr. So we have here a second view regarding blood and that which exits from the body. And here we have a dilemma, right? And this dilemma, it's not really a dilemma, but it's how you see evidence. In the first position, we had statements of Sahaba, right? Statements of Sahaba who adopted the view that you need to make wudu. As far as myself, then I don't abandon the statement of a Sahabi until there is another statement of a Sahabi in that topic. And like this, you saw the view of Imam Ahmed corresponding to the view of the Sahaba, even if there's no text in that issue, right? He would not like to go outside the statement of the Sahaba. while others would say that the foundation is freedom from responsibility, bara'atu dhamm, that an individual is not religiously responsible to do this action until there's a proof. And the statement of a sahabi in and of itself is not a proof. And so like this, you can see that disagreement. And like this, we run into that dilemma. Ibn al-Mundhir, up until now, hasn't mentioned the opinion of anyone who is not a sahabi who has that view, right? He has not mentioned the opinion of a sahabi, should I say, who had the second view. And all of the sahaba that he mentioned, the four that he mentioned, all held that the person should make wudu. And so do you take the view of the sahaba, even though there's no evidence, and establish it as a proof? Or do you take the fundamental of freedom from responsibility and establish it as a proof? This is something that leads me to say, when I talk about the Hanbali madhab versus, for example, the Zahiri madhab, and although there are many differences between them, I usually like to have a statement that I say, which is, they're almost two different sides to the same coin, meaning they both are views that want to adhere as much as they can to the Quran and the Sunnah. And that's not to negate that in the rest of the madhab. But the difference between the Hanbali and the Zahiri, in my limited view, is that you find that the Hanbali madhab, Imam Ahmed himself, rahimahullah, was one who always would err on the side of caution. If the Sahaba did it, if there was a view from them, he would rather adopt that than going away from that. While the Zahiri madhab would be one that would err on the side of freedom from responsibility. And so this is a tug of war that you'll see often playing itself out. And so it's just something that it catches my attention when reading these issues. So he mentioned those who had this view that there's no wudu necessary for a nosebleed or blood or pus leaving from any other orifice that is not from the places where one expels hadith, i.e. the penis, the vagina, or the anus, akramakumullah. He goes on to say, وَأَسْقَطَتْ فِرْقَةٌ ثَالِثَةٌ عَنِ الْقَلِيلِ مِنْهُ الْوُضُوء وروينا عن عبد الله بن أبي أوفى أنه بزق دما ثم قام فصلى وعن ابن عباس أنه قال إذا كان الدم فاحشا فعليه الإعادة وإن كان قليلا فلا إعادة عليه. He said, and there is a third group who have removed the obligation from a small amount of blood. If the amount of blood is low and small in amount, then they would remove the obligation of wudu off of the individual. He says, it has been reported to us on the authority of Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa that he spat blood, bazaqa daman. He spat blood and he stood up after that to pray. And on the authority of Ibn Abbas that he said, if the blood is fahish, yani it's an abundant amount that is repulsive, it causes the individual to be repulsed by it, then upon him is to repeat the wudu, to remake the wudu. And if it was a low amount, then there is no repeating obligatory upon him. He does not need to remake his wudu. So this is a third view. So in this issue about bleeding, we see that we have three views here. Yes, it nullifies wudu. No, it doesn't nullify wudu. And yes, it nullifies wudu if it is a lot. And no, if it's a little bit. So like, for example, sometimes a person will have gums. If they brush or they use siwak and their gums start to bleed, they don't need to make wudu. Or if they pop a pimple and the pimple has some blood, they don't need to make wudu. Those are things that are not fahish. Sometimes you'll find, like right now myself, I don't know how this happened, but I had a piece of skin that came off and my knuckle has a little blood on it. Do I have to make wudu? They would say no, because it's not a repulsive amount, right? And so they use this kind of balancing between the statements. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, well, inshallah bihi naqtim, we won't finish this bab today. We won't finish this chapter today. So we'll take as the last thing that we'll say is the statement of the author regarding this third view. He says, قال أبو بكر هذا يحتمل معنيين. يحتمل أن يكون أراد إذا صلى وفي ثوبه دم قليل فلا إعادة عليه، ويحتمل غير ذلك. وعن ابن عمر أنه عصر بثرة كانت بجبهته فخرج منها دم وقيح فمسحها وصلى ولم يتوضأ. He says that this statement, Abu Bakr, yani Ibn al-Mundhir, he says that this statement, this statement of Ibn Abbas, it carries two possibilities. Because when you look at the statement of Ibn Abbas, he says, if the blood isn't a lot, if it's not a repulsive amount of blood, then he doesn't need to repeat. So this statement, repeat, what is it referring to? He doesn't say what it's referring to. And we have to remember, when we get these statements of the Sahaba, it's not like we have the circumstances that are surrounding them in every situation to know what they were referring to. So all this statement of Ibn Abbas says is, if it is a repulsive amount of blood, then he needs to repeat. Abu Bakr, he says this statement of his carries two possibilities. It carries the possibility that he could be intending that if he prays and in his garment or on his garment there is a small amount of blood, then he does not need to repeat. I.e., he does not need to repeat the salat if there's a small amount of blood on his garment. So if that's the case, this statement has nothing to do with the nosebleed, right? He says as well, and it also carries a different possibility besides that. It carries the possibility that he could be talking about if it's not a large amount of blood that comes out of his body, then there's no repeating of the wudu upon him, as we translated it the first time. And in that we see, right, the one thing we see is, for example, the error of the translator and how it's important to not incorporate your statements into the translation, or if you do so, to make them known that they are not directly, explicitly stated. Because here we see Ibn al-Mundhir clarifying that his statement, then there's no repetition upon him, or upon him is to repeat it, that this statement could have two possible meanings. So my earlier translating by referring it specifically to the wudu would be an improper translation. It would be a translation adding to it the meaning of the chapter that is not explicitly stated by Ibn Abbas. And like this, you find that this is why the scholars say that the person, or some of the scholars say, that the person who does not speak Arabic, then he is a blind follower, because you're dependent on your translator. فنسأل الله التوفيق ونسأل الله العافية ونسأل الله أن يسدد أقوالنا وأن يقبل منا الأفعال على التقصير. Now, and then the other thing that this shows us is that it could be a proof for those who adopt this third opinion, or it could have nothing to do with the topic at all. He goes on to say, and on the authority of Ibn Umar, and remember, Ibn Umar was from the people who he mentioned in the first opinion. He says on the authority of Ibn Umar that he had once popped a pimple, asara bathra, right? He squaws a pimple, a zit, on his forehead, ala jubhatihi, kanat bi jubhatihi. And so blood and pus came out of it, and all he did was wipe it off, and he prayed, and he did not make wudu. So when he popped this zit, or this pimple, blood and that clear solution, that clear liquid, that yellow liquid came out, but he just wiped it off, and he did not remake wudu. He did not make a wudu before praying. And so this would lead us to believe that, okay, since he had the other opinion that you need to go make wudu, that he also adopts this separation between an abundance or a limited amount and what they obligate. The last thing that we'll read today, he says, وَرُوِينَا عَنْ أَبِي هُرَيْرَةَ رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه أدخل إصبعه في أنفه فخرج فيها دم ففته بإصبعه ثم صلى ولم يتوضأ. وأن جابر أنه قال لو أدخلت إصبعي في أنفي ثم خرج دم لدلكته بالبطحاء وما توضأت. وأن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه كان لا يرى أن يعيد الوضوء من القطرة والقطرتين. وأن ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه أدخل أصبعه أو أصابعه في أنفه فخضبهن في الدماء ثم قال بهن في التراب ففتهن ثم قام إلى الصلاة. And then he mentions the narrations of that. So we'll translate that, but we'll repeat it next time because we'll pick up from this paragraph next time. But the translation of the paragraph we just read before the evidence is presented, he says, it's been reported to us on the authority of Abi Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu that he inserted his finger inside of his nose and some blood came out on it. Meaning he inserted his finger in his nose. The blood wasn't pouring out, but when he stuck his finger in his nose, blood came out on his finger. So he said, فَفَتَّهُ بِإِصْبَعِهِ. And so he rubbed it off with his fingers. And then he made salat and he did not repeat wudu. Then he made salat and he did not repeat wudu. He says, and on the authority of Jabir, that radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that he said, if I were to enter my finger into my nose and blood came out, I would simply scrape it on al-batha, وهي مسيل فيه دقاق الحصى, right? The ground. I would rub it in some gravel, right? I would just scrape it on the ground, وما توضأت, and I would not make wudu. And on the authority of Abi Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that he used to see he did not used to hold the view that the individual needs to repeat their wudu because of one or two droplets. And 1 or 2 droplets of blood doesn't require you to repeat your wudu. He did not see that the individual needed to repeat their wudu because of 1 or 2 droplets. And on the authority of Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that he used to enter his fingers into his nose and they would فَخَضَبَهُنَّ فِي الدِّمَاءِ, and they would come out as if they had been painted in blood. And then he would stand ثُمَّ قَالَ بِهِنَّ فِي التُّرَابِ, and then he would do like this with them in the dirt, right? فَفَتَّهُنَّ, i.e. and wipe them off, and then he would stand and offer salah. Right, so this shows us that there was a lot of blood, but because it wasn't pouring out, and ru'af is not ru'af until it comes out of the nose. Just like qay isn't qay until it comes out of the throat and out of the mouth, right? The point of it is that, so this is why some of them say that this is from the third view, that it wasn't a lot because it wasn't enough to pour out. And like this, we've completed the 3 views. It's still upon us. The isnad, the chaining or the attaching of the third view to some of those who he mentioned it on their authority, as well as the khulasa or the summarization of this opinion from the author, which we have 283, 277. So that's 6 more pages, 5 more pages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more pages to cover. And so with Allah's permission, hopefully we can finish that next time. But for right now, we finished the first opinion that an individual needs to make wudu because of a nosebleed. The second opinion that there is no wudu for any bleeding that doesn't come from the places of hadith. And the third opinion, there is no wudu if the blood is small in amount, but if it's large or an amount that is big or considered to be repulsive, then there is a wudu necessitated. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.